This is the audio recording of the Royal Aeronautical Society Toulouse branch lecture, Fathers of the Turbojet Engine, given without the PowerPoint presentations on Tuesday the 15th of December 2015. Ian Whittle starts by describing the work of his father, Sir Frank Whittle, in the United Kingdom, and after about 19 minutes, Wolfrgang BRIX, engine expert of Airbus Deutschland, tells the story of the turbojet development in Germany. There's then a 10-minute question and answer discussion, making a total of about 42 minutes. The speakers' presentations in either PowerPoint or PDF may be downloaded from www.dibley.eu.com. That's dibley.eu.com.
When he was a schoolboy, he took a great deal of interest in aeronautics. He was quite a clever fellow, particularly at mathematics. He joined the Royal Air Force when he was 16 and became an apprentice. And they recognised his abilities, so they let him go into the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell in 1926. And goes to the RAF College at Cranwell. And whilst he was there, he wrote a thesis, because he was looking for, as many people were, for alternative forms of propulsion for aircraft. And he, in his thesis, he discussed the obvious, rockets, and he discussed the gas turbine, and he proved by calculation that the turbine had the potential to be a prime mover for aero propulsion. Now, that had already been done. Others had done that before. Way back in 1920, somebody had realized a gas turbine that would work well, an industrial gas turbine, would work well at sea level, would work just as well on top of Mount Everest at about 9,000 meters. And that was very interesting. So they were saying to themselves, well, can't we apply the gas turbine to aeronautics as a means to drive the aeroplane propeller? Well, it was found by research that this really wasn't practical, because the levels of component efficiency that were required for a small, compact, light form of gas turbine that you could apply for aero propulsion didn't seem practical. So really the gas turbine was put aside as not a good option for aero propulsion by about 1920. Now, in 1926 in the UK, an engineer by the name of Arnold Griffith wrote a report to the Air Ministry, the authority. He was working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment, which was a government agency. And this chap, Dr. Griffith, wrote a report wherein he said, words to the effect, look, I think we'd better start looking at the gas turbine, because with up-to-date aerodynamic principles which we can apply to the blades of the axial compressor, we might be able to develop an axial compressor that would have a level of efficiency, high enough compression ratio, and be compact enough and light enough for an aero gas turbine. Well, his report was accepted, and he was funded, and he began work in 1927. Now, Frank Whittle is by then halfway through his course at Cranwell, and he wrote his thesis recommending the gas turbine in 1928. And that year, he was posted onto a fighter squadron. Whilst he was on the squadron, in his spare time, he did calculations around the aerothermodynamic calculations around the gas turbine, and he was beginning to find out what others had found out before him, that component efficiencies would have to be so high. And if the gas turbine was going to produce a level of shaft horsepower equivalent to existing piston engines, the gas turbine, to Frank Whittle, didn't seem to be such a wonderful option after all. Arnold Griffith, in the meantime, is trying to work on the axial compressor at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, which which is a government agency, and what they did there was secret. Frank Whittle's serving now. He's a pilot on a fighter squadron, and he's doing his calculations there. And then he got posted in 1929 to Central Flying School to become a flying instructor. And whilst he was there, he suddenly realized jet propulsion. Now, I know he wasn't the first person to think of jet propulsion, because Maxime Guillaume had come up with the idea in 1921. But Maxime Guillaume's inspiration was the fact that at that time they were trying to apply the piston engine to jet propulsion. Hugo Junkers was very enthusiastic about the free piston form of piston engine. And so, you know, it was on the cards that the piston engine might be used as a jet propulsion form of engine. And Maxime Guillaume said, well, I think this gas turbine will be a better candidate than the piston engine. And he came up with the idea of the turbojet. But he did not follow up his idea with the necessary calculations to prove its viability. So that was Maxime Guillaume in 1921. Now, Frank Whittle in 1929 settled down to the calculations that showed that the gas turbine could be applied to aeronautics more readily as a jet propulsion unit than as a means to drive the aeroplane propeller, because he found that for a modest jet engine with a thrust of about 1,000 pounds or 450 kilograms, you could have an engine that would weigh about as much as the thrust. So for an engine weighing about 450 kilograms, you would have a thrust of about 450 kilograms. And that the compressor, he could use a centrifugal compressor, which is much easier than trying to use an axial compressor. He could have 2 stages of centrifugal compressor, each stage doing a compression ratio of 4-to-1 compression ratio into the combustion chambers, a rate of combustion of about 750 litres per hour, a lot of fuel those days, and a temperature at the turbine, and he chose the Curtis turbine, a 2-stage axial turbine as the way to go. So in his engine he had a 2-stage centrifugal compressor with a certain diameter worked out, certain speed of rotation worked out, tip speed just subsonic, into the diffuser and then into the combustion chambers, through the 2-stage axial Curtis turbine, and a temperature at the inlet of the turbine of about 800 Kelvin, which is pretty hot, about 523 centigrade for those days. Now, did they have an alloy that could withstand that kind of stress at that kind of rotation? Not too easy. But you see, the temperature of the blades of a Curtis turbine, an axial turbine like that, is much lower than the temperature of the gas at the point of entry, because of the physical properties of that kind of turbine. As you know, it's a bit like a paraffin refrigerator. Its work is used up by the turbine, so the blade temperature is lower. Something like that.
I could also speak without pictures.
But anyway, along those lines was his
You can have some pictures up on that screen, better than nothing.
So he showed his idea to his
On that screen?
Yeah, better than nothing.
Yeah.
Well, it's bigger than that, isn't it?
Well, if this works, it is of strategic importance and should be kept secret. So he sent him to the Air Ministry. This little fellow, Frank Whittle, was only 22 years of age, a very junior officer
And then we
in the
could
RAF.
send the PowerPoint out and the recording so people could listen to it at least. And look at it again. What do you think of that? I mean, you can give it now. Then we can record it orally while you do it.
Don't know much about gas
Understand?
turbines.
No.
You'd better go and see Dr.
I've
Arnold
recorded on
Griffith
my
at the Royal
iPhone.
Aircraft.
Audio.
Now, it's October 1929. Arnold Griffith had by
we need the
then,
pictures.
on paper only,
That's for the future. We're going to send
designed what he thought would be the world's first aero gas turbine engine designed to drive the aeroplane propeller, which you and I would call a turboprop. It was highly complicated. It had a 14-stage axial compressor,
So you send it out,
14-stage axial turbine, the compressor rotating within the turbine, and with contra-rotation and reverse flow from combustion. It was just so complicated, it was never going to see the light of day, despite a lot of effort. Now, Arnold Griffith is sitting there with this in his mind and on paper, and he's doing his research work on the axial compressor, and into his office comes this little pilot officer from the Royal Air Force and plonks on his desk a very simple gas turbine deriving power by reaction, a jet engine. Now, what Arnold Griffith thought to himself, I don't really know, but I would say he looked at it and thought, oh dear, this is incredibly easy, too simple, ridiculous. And he decided to tell the Air Ministry that the engine there was no merit in the idea. He said the temperature at the turbine was too high and there were no alloys in existence that would take that temperature. And he thought that Frank Whittle's other assumptions were much too optimistic. Oh, and with some glee, he found a mistake in the calculations. So he said, there's a mistake in the calculations, no, it's not worth bothering. Now, the Air Ministry didn't know any better, but they trusted Arnold Griffith because he was a very mature scientist. So they rejected the turbojet idea. Now, if you think that a two-stage centrifugal turbojet of that nature would not have worked, remember that in 1945 Rolls-Royce designed the Dart engine, their most successful turboprop engine. Guess what? It had two-stage centrifugal compressor through combustion and then 3 turbines because it was a turboprop. So it had to derive shaft horsepower. So the arrangement of the centrifugal compressors and so forth was sound. We know today that Whittle's proposal was good, and had we taken it up at the time, we could have done it. The turbine would have probably have to have been made with KE965, a nickel-chromium alloy that existed from 1927 and was used for exhaust valves. So it was a feasible proposition. Frank Whittle had made a mistake in his calculation, and as soon as he got back to Central Flying School, he sat down and he corrected his mistake, which altered all the other calculations, but the end result was at least as good as what he thought it was in the first place. And Arnold Griffith undoubtedly had the ability to do that himself. He could have corrected the mistake, and he could have gone through the calculations and seen that 1,000 pounds of thrust might be derived from this light, compact engine, and it was feasible. And he should have told the Air Ministry this, but he didn't. So, the turbojet practically died a natural death in the UK, because you have to remember that the inventor, Frank Whittle, is a busy young pilot. He had to go off and teach flying at No. 2 Flying Training School, and then he went off to be a test pilot. So nothing has happened. But when he was back at Central Flying School, he had a friend there called Pat Johnson, who had been a patent agent when he was a civilian. And Pat Johnson said, you'd better patent your idea now, because the cat is out of the bag. You've been down to see the Air Ministry with your idea. The patent was applied for in 1930 and was issued in April 1931. From that moment onwards, the patent details entered the public domain, and of course they went worldwide. It is the Trade Commissioner's duty of all embassies to pick up patents, no matter where they are, and redistribute them in the country of their own country. The patent went to Sweden and France and Germany, USA and USSR as was. The Swedes were the first to start off with the Turbojet project under Lysholm in about 1933. The Germans took up the challenge And there was the von Ohain design, which came on. He started it up in 1935, when he was at Göttingen as a graduate assistant. And then there was Herbert Wagner, who was proposing a turbojet in 1936, and then shortly followed by Weinrich and Lerner and Hermann Oestrich. So there were a lot of projects began in Germany. And I have to say that in Germany, between 1930 and 1945, you know, they had Schmidt, who had invented the pulse jet, so they were doing pulse jet research, and of course they used the pulse jet for the B-1 flying bomb, and they were proposing a fighter with a pulse jet engine. They were looking at the Loran's ramjet. They were looking at ducted fans, turboprop, turbojets, and rockets. So in Germany, there were about 6 alternatives to the piston engine under research during that time frame. So I would say, really, of all nations, the Germans were the ones who took up the turbojet with the greatest enthusiasm. In Great Britain, of course, absolutely nothing was happening. Until 1935, by which time Frank Whittle was at Cambridge University, sent there by the RAF, and he got a letter from a friend of his called Rolf Williams, and Rolf said, listen, if you haven't managed to get your turbojet going anywhere, I think we can raise the funds from a merchant bank and we can launch it. So they formed a company and called it Power Jets, and launched the first building of the engine in 1936. The Royal Air Force were very kind to Frank Whittle, very supportive. They considered him to be a bit of a protege, and they allowed him to work on his engine for a year until 1937, by which time it was running. And then they put him on the special duties list so he could get on with the project. So the British turbojet began in 1936, more or less at the same time that turbojet work was beginning and had begun in Germany. The Whittle engine, which is called the WU, took a long time. They had a lot of problems with combustion and terrible shortage of funds. But it did eventually get recognized by the government, and in 1939 they made the project secret, which is a bit late. It was 10 years too late, really. And anyway, the engine became the W1 and was installed in the British aeroplane known as the Gloucester E-2839. That's experimental aeroplane number 28, ordered by the government in 1939. And that little aeroplane, which is hanging up in the Science Museum in London now, that little aeroplane flew in May 1941, nearly 2 years after Ernst Heinkel had flown his HE-178, which Wolfgang is much more qualified to talk about than I am. The 178 powered by the von Ohain centrifugal engine, which was eventually ditched about 1941 or 42 as unsuitable for aerial propulsion. But nevertheless, it flew the world's first turbojet aeroplane. The Whittle engine flying the E-28, I would say, is probably a very viable engine, and became the W2 and powered the British fighter known as the Meteor. It was a twin-engine fighter, quite pedestrian, not fast, particularly fast, but fast enough to catch the B-1 flying bomb, which we deployed it against the B-1 flying bomb. And I flew Meteors when I was in the Royal Air Force, and I found it a very nice aircraft to fly. And so, that's how we launched the turbojet in the UK. And as you could see from what I said, it was touch and go as to whether we ever would do. It very nearly never happened, which would have been rather sad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks very much, Ian.
My name is Wolfrgang BRIX. I have been engine expert to this company for 36 years, and in 2005 I have retired. And after 2 years, I decided to write a book about all the engines and aircraft that I had seen in my life. And my first chapter was the inventors. And in the course of my studies, I then met the family of the German inventor Hans von Ohain. And in 2008, I was lucky to meet Ian Whittle, the son of the British inventor, Sir Frank Whittle. And we two have then developed a correspondence about the whole story of the history of the engines. And then we decided we could do a presentation together. Found a location here, and we found a host. Thank you very much for inviting us. And now I have prepared a 31-page presentation with a lot of pictures. Now we cannot show the pictures, but I can tell you the story, and I make it a bit shorter. The best part of that story is the story of this man called Hans von Ohain. He was a German, he had studied in Göttingen, and he was a physicist. And his first patent was about a light diode for transferring sound into light or something. He made a patent of it and learned how to make patents. And then he had an experience in 1931, I think. He flew with a Junkers Ju-52 from Berlin to Cologne. And he was horrified by the noise of this aircraft and sat there and said to himself, I can make it better. I will find now an elegant process to drive an aircraft. And he sat down, and his first idea was to use an engine without moving parts, what we call today a ramjet. And you know, ramjets only work beyond Mach 1. Then he sat down and tried to find another process. And he had found in a book called Gas and Steam Turbines a so-called Nernst turbine, which was a very simple thing. And then he has developed it further down, and in the end he found an engine with a very simple radial compressor and a very simple radial turbine back to back, and wrote a patent. And then he decided to build a prototype. He had a little garage in Göttingen where his little car was maintained, and there was a man in this garage, Max Hahn, and he said to him, can you build me this? And he had money from his grandmother. Sometimes you find a sum of 1,000 marks, and then they started to build a prototype. It was very primitive, and it did not run. No, it did not run properly, but when you stopped the starter motor, it stopped. And Max Hahn said to him, oh, doctor, but at least the flame comes out at the right side. So his professor at the university, Professor Pohl, helped him. He even looked after the theory. And then he said to him, you need a professional help from the industry. So I can write to everyone in Germany. So whom do you want me to write? And von Ohain had been in Rostock sailing on the Baltic Sea. And so he said, oh, and he knew that this Ernst Heinkel was a man who thought, who pursued the way to very fast aircraft. So he thought, well, that could be the right man. And so his professor wrote a letter to Professor Ernst Heinkel. And Heinkel saw a chance and invited him. And they met there in 1936. And I have even found the villa where they met. when you walk down the promenade in Warnemünde at the Baltic Sea, there is still this villa standing. And Heinkel was, he liked the idea. Next morning he has ordered his whole technical directors to check this man. And one said a sentence which was interesting. He said, well, the idea of a turbojet is known, but this seems to be a new practical chance to do it. And they hired this man. And they gave him a man from the company, Gundermann, as engineer. And then, very secretly, they have developed this engine. First, they tried again this garage model. They had brought it with them. And it did not run properly. And then they built the same engine with all the capabilities of the company, all the machinery and all that, and it did not run properly. And then they decided, yeah, we need at least half or a year to solve the combustion problem. And then they decided to go two ways. One way was to build an engine that proves that you can make with a jet, you can make thrust. And the second ambition, or the second way was to develop a proper combustion chamber. And this hydrogen engine was then built, and it ran. It ran properly, because hydrogen burning is very simple. It burns without any problems. You must not have drops and fuel drops and all that. You just feed in hydrogen, it's running. And that was around the time that his father had ran his engine. So, and both did not know of the other side. Then Heinkel was happy, and then he decided, okay, now we build a flight engine, and we build an aircraft for it. And then they spent 2 years, until 1939, to build a flight engine and to build the aircraft called Heinkel He 178. And first they tested it under another Heinkel bomber, which was happy, but on one day on landing they had a fuel leak and the whole aircraft burned and the engine was burned and the pilots could be saved. So then they had only one engine, which was then installed in this Heinkel 178. And on the 27th of September in 1939, they flew for the first time, they flew for the first time this aircraft. And it was 5 days before war began. And when the pilot Erich Wasitz landed, after 6 minutes of flying, Heinkel ran to the telephone to tell it his best friend, who worked in the RAeS, Luftfahrtministerium, which was Ernst Udet. Udet was a fighter pilot from the First World War, and he was director of the technical department. He was responsible for all these developments of weapons and aircraft and whatsoever. And Heinkel cried into the telephone, the first jet flight in history, and Udet said, okay, congratulations, and now let me sleep again. It was 6 in the morning, and Udet his head was full of the next war, of which Heinkel did not know anything. And then the second flight was in November, so the war was already happening. And Udet came to Rostock and he saw the aircraft flying and he said nothing. But when he came back to Berlin, he issued a money and the order to Heinkel, now build me a fighter aircraft with 2 engines under the wing. And Heinkel has built it. It was the Heinkel He 280. it flew, and it was then overtaken by the Messerschmitt 262, which was built parallel to all that. In Germany we had then two other men who built engines. One was Anselm Franz. He was project leader at Junkers, and he built the so-called UMO 004. And the other man was called Hermann Oestrich. He built at BMW, the BMW 003. And both engines were running better. And the May 262 was faster, heavier, better than the Heinkel 280. So all the intentions of Heinkel ended when the Heinkel 280 was cancelled and his engines were cancelled. And in the end, the May 262 was the big fighter, and the BMW 003 was built into the Arado 234, which was a small bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. And the final sentence to all the German history is it ended in May 45, and the result is at the first day of the war we had one turbojet in Germany, and in the end they had produced 6,700. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Sorry, why I wanted to try and get this going, because I know how Wolfgang spent an awful lot of time in many versions of his PowerPoint. What I've done is to record this on my Apple iPhone, which does work, and we can put out your presentation on the web. So if you like to see his presentation, and you can be reminded of his words. So do we have any questions? Do both of you want to come up and answer questions?
What happened to Sir Frank after the war? Did he continue in aerojets, and how long did he live?
Oh, well, answering the second part first is the easiest. He died in 1996 when he was 89. After the end of the war, well, they nationalised power jets, so at the end of the war he carried on for a bit, but in 1946 it was pretty beastly. He'd got an engine called the W2700 with an aft fan and reheat, because I should have pointed out to you, but I didn't know, I was rushing a bit, but he dreamt up the turbo fan between 1930 and the end of 33. He had the idea of the high bypass engine and of the use of reheat to augment thrust, you see. Well, in 1946, well after the end of the Second World War, he was trying to build his W2700 with an aft fan, not very dissimilar to the GE engine that they put into the Convair 990, and with reheat. But the British government, I'm afraid they just cancelled it. They pulled the rug from under his feet, really, so he resigned. So in answer to your question, he became really quite unwell due to the stress and disappointment. And in 1948, they deemed him unfit for flying duties, not that he was doing much flying, so he resigned from the Royal Air Force. He gave the nation all his patent rights, and he was given a knighthood and some money, £100,000 sterling, and he went, from then onwards he did consultancy work and that kind of thing. His turn.
Yeah.
Come on, somebody.
Actually, it's your turn again, because we've already been told at the end of the war, what was it, 6,700 engines built. How many were built in Britain at that stage?
Very few.
And
Very few.
after that, it took off very, very fast, with also the engines built then in the United States and Russia and so on.
Well,
So-
Rolls-Royce took over, really.
Yeah.
You see, they took over the project in 1943, and the Meteor soon was powered by the Mean engine, which was straight through combustion. And we had about 15 or 16 air forces worldwide using the Meteor. So there were a lot of them built in the end, quite a number of engines, but the 004, as Wolfgang said, they produced a vast number of those in the very short time that, I mean, it didn't start coming off the production lines, the 004, the UMO engine, until September 1944, and yet before the end of the war they built over 6,000 of them. So there you go.
If you are interested in this story, then I can recommend you a book that is called Not Much of an Engineer. It is written, you know that? No? It is a book by Sir Stanley Hooker. Hooker has been a big boss at Rolls-Royce, then later at Bristol Engines, and came back to Rolls-Royce. And he was involved in the whole development of the jet engine with his father. And he describes in his books the long story, how each version is built on top of the other. And the book is really funny. He was a mathematician and a thermodynamicist, and he was a bit unhappy with his job, and he applied at Rolls-Royce. And he was then interviewed by the big boss of Rolls-Royce called Lord Hythe, and he looked at him and the papers of him, and then he said, well, you are not much of an engineer, but he hired him. And this Stanley Hooker then developed the supercharger to the Merlin engine. The Merlin was in the Spitfire, and he could improve the performance of this engine and the aircraft by 20–30% just by redesigning the supercharger, the way the air is going through it. And this book is incredible. He has saved then the RAeS-211, which is today the whole Trent family. They Rolls-Royce were bankrupt because his engine was so bad. And then he came back, and he has then, in 2 weeks, they could make the engine run again properly. Yeah. This is a book you will never forget. I just read it to repeat the story of all these WHITTLE engines. I read it now a third time, I think, because it's so full of many facts and numbers. And if you are, I am a propulsion engineer, a thermodynamicist, some passages in this book you will only understand if you have some idea of a thermodynamic cycle, how it works and so on.
You can find it on Amazon if you want it.
Yeah, it is still, you find it on Amazon, 22 € something. Yeah.
What happened to the German engineers? Were they
Yeah.
hired abroad?
Hans von Oheim has gone to America. He was in Dayton, Ohio, and he has been then a consultant to the Americans. And in the winter time, he went down to Florida, and his best friend of that time once called me from Florida to tell me the story of his friend Hans von Oheim. And yeah, he has died in '98. Yeah. This Anselm Franz, who had built the UMO 004, later went to Lycoming and has developed a lot of engines in that company. And Hermann Oestrich, who had built the BMW 003, went to Snecma and built the ATAR. You know, ATAR, Mirage, and so on. So they all were, after the war, rather successful. Any more?
Can I ask you about a question about Mesh 262, because Popular
books say that the engine handling was extremely delicate. Okay, they even say that virtually you have to fly 262 on a fixed throttle, otherwise you would lose the engine. Is there any truth in that at all?
I don't know.
Yeah, there is, because I know Eric Brown personally, who's flown it, and Eric's at 96 now.
Yeah?
Wonderful guy.
Still going.
He did fly this.
Still going.
But you see, it's the old axial compressor problem.
Yep.
And they solved the problem. Instead of variable inlet guide vanes and bleed air valves, which hadn't been dreamt up in those days, they had this movable bullet in the jet pipe, which was controlled by the throttle. So as you opened up the throttle, the bullet moved backwards and unchoked the engine. Then when you throttled back, the thing moved forward and choked the engine to give you the back pressure so that the compressor didn't go into total stall. So it was a damn good idea, but I don't know who invented that idea, do you? It was clever.
Not me.
It was, it was very clever, and BMW used it for the 003 as well. But the engine was very delicate. It was great. If you get it to full power, leave it alone. But you couldn't do high energy manoeuvres either. You see, the Measure at 262 was incredibly fast. But, because it had, 14 or 17 degrees of sweep back and a thin wing and all the fuel in the fuselage and da-da-da-da-da, and it was a fantastic airplane, ahead of its time aerodynamically. But the engine was an absolute bastard because, you know, poor old Luftwaffe pilots, they're in this airplane going like shit off a shovel, which was all very well, but their overtaking speed of any lumbering old bomber was huge. So they only had a few seconds, about 2 seconds to fire, and then they had to peel off. And then they couldn't wrap it round for another attack quickly. They had to turn very carefully and then come back, and by which time, of course, the Mustangs or whatever the fighters were that were escort were waiting for them. You know, it was a very tricky business. And when they throttled back to land, they really had to get in first time, because if they misjudged it, had to open up quickly, the engine would stop. So it was a very tricky aeroplane, very tricky. But aerodynamically, way ahead of its time. Yeah.
I think, a comment, you mentioned that the flame coming out over in the right end, at the right end of that first engine. You look at the first flight of the 262, when you throttle back after landing, flames come out of both ends.
Yeah. There's a movie
very well
on the internet. Yeah, it was not so easy.
Do we have any other questions?
What we do have for you, which hasn't gone wrong, is your celebrated tankards. And we've even got your names on it. What did you say your name was? They all are Wolfgang, even with your name on it this time.
I'm going to fill it up with German beer.